Hello and welcome to The Agenda with me and Phil Morehouse, who's joining us virtually from his cafe in North Lincolnshire. So big thanks out to Danilo, who has contributed a €50 super chat even before we started. So thank you so much. And the comment was, seems super chats via PayPal only work on Android. Well, there you go. So if you're trying to pay by PayPal on Apple, you're shit out of luck. Silly me, expected to work in the browser that the owners of PayPal produce. Anyway, there be a donation, Captain. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So I think we're going to struggle with things to talk about today, Phil, because nothing's happened this week.
Well, yes. I mean, the Tories have basically now pretty much confirmed that they've gone. In fact, my 5 o'clock video for today on my own channel is they've come completely off the rails, and that's it. They're going to stay there now.
They've gone mad.
It's not just that, because you might think to yourself, because we had the loony conventions in the last week, that obviously there's been more media attention on the extremists in the party. Yeah. But the ones that you might consider to be the sane ones, the sane voices, have been almost completely absent. If I was to pick on the number of Tory MPs who want to actually focus the party on people, voters, not their own personal ideologies, you've got Tobias Ellwood, who gave an interview last Sunday, which will have missed most people by. And you had Michael Gove, who actually spoke at the Looney Convention, but to say, and he was not appreciated for saying this by the audience, but to say that the Tories cannot win with culture wars. But but in terms of that, everyone else that is representing the Conservative Party is basically saying, want to bet? So that's where they've gone now. Suella Braverman had a great deal of personal media attention on her this week. So, and she was doing it for herself. She made her speech as a pitch, right? It was a pitch. So she was trying to sell herself. So how did that go? Well, last week, YouGov had Suella Braverman's personal approval rating on -35. Now it's on -38. So she may well have appealed to some Conservative Party members who will make her the next loony leader, but she is not appealing to people in general.
She's just not appealing to people in general.
No.
I say.
She doesn't appeal. So what's going to happen, right? If she's made the next, so the Conservatives lose next year's election. At the moment, they're doing nothing to win it, and Labour are focused on winning it. So to me, the contest, Labour have to, it's like, I keep saying, it's like watching your football team and they're like 5-0 up at half time and you can sit back and relax. Now, I will just point out that Sheffield Wednesday lost their first leg of their playoffs 5-0 and still came back and won it. So you never know.
You never know.
But by and large, as a supporter, you can sit back and go, I'm comfortable with this position.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Tories are going to lose. And they may well make Suella Braverman their next leader. If they do so.
What?
Of course they can. All he has to do is get the loony nomination.
That would be brilliant and terrifying in equal measure, because brilliant, because they'll never win again, would they?
Well, not for a while. They won't, because what will happen is she will then, and there could be others, who knows, but she definitely wants to be that leader. She will then not have the support of the majority of MPs in all likelihood. Yeah. And she won't have the support of the majority of the public. So it will be an incredibly toxic leadership for the Conservative Party brand. Now, it's possible she ends up being like Ian Duncan Smith and they don't even let her run a general election. It might be that she's so bad that they get rid of her after a couple of years. But all that does is generate, the Tories in opposition, if they want to come back, have to stabilize themselves. And that's not going to happen. And the thing is as well, it's not even like, let's say Suella Braverman does really badly, like stunningly badly, and they get rid of her after a couple of years. So she's not going to lead them into the next election. It's not like they'll necessarily go for a sane candidate, because there are several. It's not like that there's the right of the party and then the moderates. There's more than 2 factions. Yeah. There are at least 3 factions on the right of the party. There's the Boris Johnson fan club. he may just disappear into the sunset after the election. So that may disappear. Who knows? But at the moment, there's the Boris Johnson cultists. There's the Liz Truss Looney Brigade, and then there's the Suella Braverman ERG crew.
There's no nice way of putting it, is it? It is literally the Looney Brigade.
Yeah. So those are the three factions on the extreme right. There are other factions within the Tory party as well. Those are the three main factions on the extreme right.
Yeah.
Which ones are left in a strong position after the election is another matter, because the Tories are going to lose basically over half of their MPs. But that's the position they're going to find themselves in. They could bounce between different unsuitable leaders until, like Labour, until they've been in opposition for so long that they get sick of it and decide to actually take things seriously.
Yeah.
Because right now they've lost their competitive edge. They're not trying to be competitive. They're indulging themselves because they've been in power for too long and they're complacent.
Well, I mean, this week has just been incident after incident of them, of people in the Tory party shooting their mouths off, and just everyone around them just face palming, going, "Will you shut up?" I mean, this is great for us because it's showing that they are a bunch of lunatics and they shouldn't be listened to. But they've really shown their true colours this week, to a quite disturbing degree.
Yes, yeah. There's a couple of questions in here. I'm just saying, one angry pagan asking, it's quite an interesting one. Have Labour said at all how they will deal with the 40 new hospitals in quotation marks? Tory manifesto promised. Do Labour have a plan? Whereas the Tories obviously didn't. I haven't seen anything specific on it, but what I would say is when we talk about 40 new hospitals, there were never going to be 40 new hospitals. There were supposed to be 40 hospital renovations. That is going to happen, because at the moment, there are several hospital buildings that are close to collapse. In fact, Liz Truss during the leadership contest last year, she mentioned that one of her local, where is she based? I can't remember where she's based now, but one of her local hospitals, and there were photographs of this, actually has, from the inside, the ceilings being supported by metal struts, because it is actually collapsing. Obviously, Labour cannot really allow that to happen on their watch. I mean, if it happens on their watch, it'll happen straight away. So, I haven't seen anything specific, but it would be inconceivable that there will not be a serious building program, because it's not about building new hospitals. The ones we have are falling down.
Yeah.
Because the buildings are past the end of their natural life.
Yeah.
So, yes, I haven't seen anything specific, but inevitably that will have to happen.
Oh, my word.
Danilo saying there, I think there's a good chance the Tories will split after being routed in the next general election. The thing is, I don't think that, partly because they'll be too small to split. They will be losing half of their MPs. But in fact, William says Norwich. It may be Norwich that Liz Truss hangs around in. But the reason is the Conservatives cannot win without being a broad church. They can't win, just like Labour can't win. So although Labour have sort of split in the past, in my lifetime, in fact, to a small extent, it was limited and largely driven by principle. The Tories, their principle is power. This is, the left, there's multiple parties that are either on the left or sort of hover over the left, because people on the left have sort of principles beyond just merely being in power. People on the left want power for a purpose, whereas on the right, they want power just to stop other people having power. So the principle for them is power, and they can't achieve power without that broad church. So there is no incentive for the Tories to split. They will internally split. They'll have their arguments. They'll have the factional battles, but ultimately they can't afford to actually split into two parties.
That's a shame, because I kind of assumed that would happen after the next election, especially if we have proportional representation come in. That will be that'll be the point.
PR will split them. PR will absolutely split them, because then you can have your. In fact, it may just be that they naturally form into the Conservative Party and Reform UK. Yeah. They may join Reform UK.
Yeah.
Who knows? But they will absolutely split themselves into two parties then, because with proportional representation, you can do that. you don't suffer. It might be that if they can get enough votes, that one of those factions could then form. In fact, it helps them to split. It might be that those on the far right join a different party, or it might be that those in the moderates in the Conservative Party physically eject them.
Yeah.
Because then they can become more palatable and potentially form a coalition with the Lib Dems in the future, which, obviously the Lib Dems are not interested in that right now because the Tory brand is incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
But, given that proportional representation, if we see it, we're probably not going to see it for about 10 years. And then it'll still take some time for the Tories to detoxify themselves. So you may be talking 20 or 30 years' time before they can realistically come to power again.
Oh God, that would be. Never again after this. It will. You're right, because it will take a generation to kind of forget how bad it was.
Yeah, but it won't take a generation for them to come back under first past the post because they don't need a majority. I keep saying the biggest indictment of first past the post was actually the 2005 general election, which Labour won, and they won more MPs than the Conservatives have now. They didn't win as big a majority as they got in 2016, but in terms of the number of MPs Tories have got now, so it was a good majority, and they won it with something like 32% of the vote or something, or 33.
Wow.
And it was only, I see, because I looked it up recently to do a video. It wasn't even that it was like, oh, well, how bad were the Tories off? The Tories were only 2.8% behind them in terms of the vote share. And yet the Labour won like over 100 MPs extra compared to the Tories. And it was like, although I was pleased that my party won, you looked at it and you thought, this isn't right. This isn't right at all, because it was an absolute mastery of a campaign to win a good majority in Parliament with less than a third of the votes. But it's not right, is it?
No, I mean that's ridiculous, and it just shows, I guess, why Labour are really reluctant, especially in the leadership, are really reluctant to embrace PR. But if they're ever going to do it, I think now's the time to do it.
Well, strategically, what I've tended to say is certainly you can understand them not doing it right now. This is why I always say, does Keir Starmer want it or not? I genuinely don't know. And that is because it's clear he's not going to offer it in the next election.
Yeah.
But at the same time, thinking about it strategically, what does Keir Starmer want to do? He's not a politician. He hasn't been in politics. He just wants to come in, do a thing and go away. He's got these reforms in mind. We know what the reforms are. And he wants a large majority to deliver them. So, and that includes abolition of the House of Lords, setting up more regional decision making.
Yeah, which I really agree with. I mean, that devolving Parliament to the different regions is so important. I mean, you look at like Northern Powerhouse Rail. That hasn't happened.
No, of course not.
Instead of that, we get the absolute opposite of a powerhouse. We get a shit house of a rail system.
And there are downsides to it. There are absolute downsides because, and we've seen it with devolution, even though the benefits are overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
And you will get the same thing. So if you like compare, say, the Scottish Parliament, because I'll pick on those because at the moment the government is the SNP, who will never be in government in Westminster. So whenever anything positive happens, they'll claim credit for it. Whenever anything negative happens, they'll blame the Westminster government, and vice versa. Yeah. When everything bad is happening in Scotland, Westminster will say, well, that's actually the fault of the Scottish government, and vice versa. So you will get that as well. You will get, for some people, it'll be like knowing where the buck stops. So the advantage of centralizing power is, well, it's obvious where the buck stops. But the overwhelming benefit is you are getting decisions made by people who live in the place where those decisions are being made for. And that is worth the downsides. That is worth the extra political bickering.
It's crucial. I mean, it's crucial to democracy as well, because one of the reasons why I started this channel and one of the reasons why I started doing political stuff in the first place was just I really felt like my voice and the voice of people my friends and family, everything was just not being listened to, especially up north here.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hello, and for a long time, and even Labour did this under Blair and Brown.
Yeah.
There was very much a London-centric way of seeing things, and they thought, well, if this is good for London, then it's good for the country, and that wasn't necessarily the case.
The thing is I don't want to ape because the right wing at the moment, they're trying to blame all of their ills, all of their failures on the blob, the Whitehall blob, right? But there is a sense at which there is an element of the fact that because it's not necessarily politicians, because bear in mind, Gordon Brown, Scotland, he's not just Scottish, he was a Scottish MP.
Yeah.
Tony Blair, was a southerner, but he was near you. He represented Sedgefield, that's up north.
Yeah.
So actually, the two most senior.
I think I'm more north than that. Yeah, Wildling beyond the wall up here.
But the point is that the two most senior members of that Labour government were both northern MPs.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was. But clearly the government and the government's decisions were London-centric. And why was that? Two things. First of all, it's the argument that Boris Johnson tried to use. If you're trying to think purely in terms of financial return for investments, then London and the surrounding areas already have all the infrastructure, lots of skilled workers and all the rest of it, whereas you have to force investment elsewhere. But the other thing is, why, given that the people who came up with solutions, because a politician, right, doesn't have any qualifications, even if you've got clever politicians in charge, they have to say, this is our policy. And then officials have to say, this is how we can turn it into a workable plan, right? They can't come up with the plan. They don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And all of those people lived in London because they were all based in Whitehall. So there is an essence in which, so the right wing are saying that Whitehall fights against the government. That's not true. They will do their best. It's not their fault if the government give them impossible aims. But if you give them a policy, they will work out some practical solutions for it. Yeah. But because they are London-based, their decisions will be London-centric. It's the same with the BBC. A lot of people in Scotland think it's biased towards England. And it's like, and I say as someone from England that also isn't represented by the BBC, it's actually biased towards London. It is London-centric. Yes. And again, because
and also
most of its major programming is decided in London.
If you want to work for the BBC or any major broadcaster in this country, you have to work for free in London for like a year. And there is a tiny percentage of the population who have the funds to do that from Bank of Mum and Dad. If you don't have that funding, it's really, really difficult to get a job at the BBC. And then you
have to basically make your name somewhere else. And then they
buy you in. Yeah, like Gary Lineker. Who they hate because all the tabloids hate him because he's a working class lad done good.
Some of them do, yeah. That's the other problem as well. I mean, this will get you. Too many of them from privately educated backgrounds.
All of them, pretty much.
Pretty much, yes.
It is the exceptions that people go, but what about this person? You're like, you give me one. I've just given you 500 people in the public eye who are in private school. Who got into position of public. What's it called? The public eye, and went to public school.
But so that's the thing. You have the decisions made. If you have the decisions made for the Northeast, say, where you are made in the Northeast, then you will. I mean, it's like any other system. There'll be some corruption in there. There obviously is in Teessides at the moment. They deny it, but all I would say is, why can't we have an independent inquiry then? But you'll still be prey to corruption. You'll still be prey to incompetence, but you have got a much higher chance of having decisions made that are actually in the interest of that region.
Yeah, true. Okay, I've put my volume up. Apparently, I'm a bit unbalanced. I'll put Phil down a little bit. So just go into the chat. Vendetta's just dropped a £1 super chat. Thank you very much, Vendetta. And Danilo says, in a PR system, the Tories will become moderate by default. Radical parties cannot flourish in a PR system for lack of potential coalition partners, which sometimes they can, sometimes they can't.
You do have some countries of PR where you do get them, but they tend to be frozen out of government.
Yeah, Italy and Israel are two examples where they do have PR. And
Italy doesn't have PR. It has some PR. It's
It has
like
some PR and some
Holyrood.
first past the
It has
post,
a little.
doesn't it?
So actually, it's not a. You wouldn't describe it as a PR
Okay.
country.
All right. Sorry, take that back. Sorry, Italy.
So, because that's what people will say. They'll say, "Well, what about Maloney then?" But it's like, yeah, not PR.
Yeah.
If it were PR, she wouldn't have won.
Yeah. So we've
Spain
also
is a PR. Spain is
Yeah.
full PR.
Yeah.
Like Germany isn't even full PR. There's a lot of countries have some PR.
What
and
I
it's not
think I would
complete.
like to see is having that PR system in the lower house, because there's a question here from William Hawkins asking, if the House of Lords is abolished and replaced with a democratically elected second chamber, how do we justify primacy of the Commons? But to that, well, I'd say, well, the laws are created in the Commons, and then you have the oversight in the upper chamber, which is normal, isn't it?
The intention for the new, it's not, I don't know what it's going to be called. It probably won't be called the House of Lords. The intention for the new chamber, from Keir Starmer anyway, is that its role is threefold. First of all, to scrutinise legislation from the Commons, not to overrule it. Second, to hold the government, not the House of Commons, the government to account. So if, for example, this second chamber believes that the government are doing something unconstitutional, this second chamber would have the right to vote to get the Supreme Court to investigate.
Yeah.
So it would actually give this second chamber. So at the moment, there's worries about the government clipping the wings of our independent judiciary. This would give the second chamber the authority over the Supreme Court to say, no, we think this is wrong. You need to investigate it.
Yeah.
And the third purpose is that regional balance. They're there to represent. So they're there to scrutinise legislation. Second, to defend the Constitution.
Yeah.
And third, to provide that regional
Well, I think
voice,
that regional balance is so important. I think that it should be run a little bit like we run the the football board. Is it the football board that's above FIFA? And it's like got 5 members. It's got England FA, Wales FA, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then a 5th seat for the rest of the world. But the rest of the world's seat is worth 4 votes. So the home countries of the home nations of the UK can't impose new changes to the rules in football, like VAR, etc., without FIFA giving the thumbs up. And also FIFA can't do anything without the other, at least one of the other boards coming on, FAs coming on board.
Yeah.
So a system like that, I don't want to ever be in a situation again in which England drags Scotland and Northern Ireland out of the EU against their democratically
because there is democratic will. Because this is the thing, we are like, it's a weird situation. If you look at the UK as a whole, you can say, well, the vast, like 5/6 of the population live in England, but it's not a homogenous nation. We're made of 3 and a bit nations, really.
Yes.
And that should be respected. Because we're a federal nation without the federal infrastructure, is how I keep describing it.
Yeah.
And that's what's ultimately caused a lot of the problems. We're a federal nation that has this centralized power, which is no good, particularly when it's centralized in a place that creates like sort of disapproval from others. Because like at the moment we have a Conservative government, and the Conservatives are just like Labour at the moment, technically nowhere in terms of Scottish seats in Westminster. So it shouldn't have been possible to make such a large constitutional change with just one, when we've got 4 legislative bodies in the UK, major ones.
3.5.
3 parliaments and an assembly.
That's never open. No, I meant Northern Ireland, the DUP.
That's an assembly rather than a parliament. So we've got 3 parliaments and an assembly. And it shouldn't have been possible for one of those parliaments, even though it is the prime one, it shouldn't have been possible for it to have made a decision that is against the wishes of all of the other 3.
Yeah. Well, Danilo's saying the UK would work better if it was split into federal states like Germany. England alone should be 5 or 8 different states, which I kind of agree with.
Yes.
And that's again going into that system of, it's not just ideological centrism, as in let's find a way that everyone can get a consensus of opinion pretty much on before we move forward. It's also geographical. And again, what is good for the goose isn't necessarily good for the gander, is it?
Yeah.
In politics. And a lot of these MPs they're in their bubble anyway. As we mentioned before, when we talked about the PPC, a lot of them went to private school. They don't have any working class friends. They never hung out in, inner city comps, or, had to climb up the steps of a tower block because the lift wasn't working, or had to scrabble down the back of the couch for 20p to put in the meter. They don't know what that's like.
This is why Anne Widdecombe early this week was able to say, when someone said, well, what if you can't afford a cheese sandwich? She just said, well, don't have a cheese sandwich. It's because she clearly doesn't even understand that a cheese sandwich represents like the cheapest food you can get.
Yes.
It's like,
the cheapest sandwich.
So what you're saying is they should starve or eat gravel, because like, a normal person will just look at that and go, if you can't afford a cheese sandwich, what do you think? But she doesn't know. She doesn't know the difference between a cheese sandwich and lobster thermidor in terms of cost, because she just gets what she wants. I do at the moment, but there's been times in the past when I have had to budget very severely. There was times in the past when I could, I just had one main meal a day, and it was, my weekly shopping was like cheap sausages, cheap chips, cheap beans, and they were cheap then, cheap eggs and cheap bread. And I just made something from some combination of that each day.
Yeah.
£6 a week was my food budget. Yeah. Obviously, this was a long time ago. So, but but these people have never experienced that, and they never will.
But like for me, I'll go to the shop, and the pint of milk's gone up from what it was 66p to 99p. It's been turned on.
It's come down in some supermarkets now. Apparently,
yeah, but recently. That's not my local shop. If I want to go to the supermarket, my nearest Lidl is an hour's.
That is the other thing that a lot of people don't understand. So, where a lot of people are, okay, these you can get deliveries from Tesco or wherever, but you have to pay for it. You either pay a subscription or you pay for each delivery, right? There's a lot of people there, if they can't get to the supermarket, there are now supermarkets like in like town centres and stuff. But I remember when the big expansion of the supermarkets came out, they were in the middle of nowhere. They sort of had to be. It was part of the deal. They had to have architecturally pleasing looks. They weren't allowed to open for more than certain hours on Sundays, and they had to be essentially out of the way so that they didn't take business from the local corner shops. That was the idea. And what that means is that for a lot of people who are poor and who cannot really afford to justify even the cost of a bus into town, they're getting their shopping at the local corner shop, but it's more expensive.
Yeah.
So it's like, if whatever 30p Lee or his ilk come up with as you could get this from like Asda or something, I've worked it out. It's like, what about people who can't get to Asda? They've only got the Spar or something like that down the bottom of their street.
Yeah.
And that is more expensive. You try coming up with a budget for there. Less choice, more cost.
But also, 30p Lee and his ilk, they look at how much it costs to survive, not to live.
Well, what they
survive.
Think. Yeah, they're not even right about that because they're not nutritionists. They've got no idea.
Yeah. One angry pagan asked something, but I've lost where it was in the chat. With PR, does that finally give some space for the SDLP and others, or are we more like to see new leftist socialist parties?
Under PR, it depends what system of PR. I want full PR, which effectively means most people, although you can vote for an independent, and you will be able to, and some independents may even win, most people are going to vote for a party, and you're going to probably vote for an established party that's got the infrastructure going.
Yeah.
So it will be very difficult to set up a new party unless you've got a load of money. So you may look at, there's a Brexit party in Reform UK. Yeah, they had a crap load of money. We don't know where it's come from, but they have a crap load of money, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking about a left-wing party, do you know what? There isn't a load of money for left-wing parties. We can see that in the media. There's like, in terms of the left-wing media, you've got the Mirror. You've got some smaller ones. You've got the Morning Star and the Canary, but most people don't know about those. You've got some publications that are fair, like the Yorkshire Post a little bit, Byline Times, the Independent can
Liverpool Echo.
So yeah, the smaller ones. But in terms of the mainstream media, in terms of left wing, you've got the media. And the reason for that, and that's just to give the left wing something.
Yeah.
The reason for that is because no one with crap loads of money willing to buy up our media is interested in pushing left wing ideas.
Yes.
And the same will be true of political parties.
Yeah.
You know, so
I think as well, like there's a thing where people go, oh, you look at PR, or you look like at universal basic income, or you look at the regulation of the press or something like that, and they go, well, that's not going to work, because they look at it in isolation. But this has to be a holistic approach where we change the entire system of how we do things in this country, because one thing won't work without the other. So the idea that we could just bring in UBI tomorrow, that's for the birds. We can't. We need to.
Well, we haven't got a plan for it yet.
Yeah, but we need to put
one of those
things in place.
Like, hello, Danilo's just got a pay rise. The I'll just mention one thing quickly, then we'll come to that. It's no, I've forgotten it. We'll go to Danilo's.
Okay, Danilo's. Sorry, go on.
Go on, you do it.
Okay, Danilo's just dropped another €20 super chat into the chat. Thank you so much. The best thing about proper PR is that it allows radical parties into parliament, where they will promptly either self-destruct or become moderate. I agree with that. What's your take on that sort of POV?
I mean, if we look at Germany, for example, although I said it's not full PR, there's a lot of PR. And someone mentioned earlier the Green Party. If the Green Party in this country have one seat, they're only going to ever have one seat. And if Caroline Lucas retired, they might not even win that. You know, that's all they're going to get.
Under first past the post. I mean, under PR.
Under first past the post. But under PR, see, the same thing was true in Germany. When Germany introduced PR decades ago, the Green Party grew.
Yeah.
And the reason it will happen in this country as well is, at the moment, the Green Party, in terms of their share of the vote, are already worth a number of MPs. They'd already be above the level of the Lib Dems now. Not then, because the Lib Dems would also gain more. So they'd be worth quite a few MPs. Now, they would have to stabilise, of course, because they'd suddenly get a load of candidates who aren't experienced politicians. But what will happen is, with PR, at the moment, what happens is there are people who are, if they were to pick from all the parties, are Green Party supporters. But when it comes to the general election, like most people, recognise that the government is either going to be Labour or the Conservatives, and they switch their vote, if they're Green Party supporters, probably to Labour. Whereas with PR, the reason they do that is because if they vote for the Green candidate, they know all they're doing is helping the Conservative candidate, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if they switch it to either the Lib Dems or Labour, depending on where they live, or even the SNP or Plaid, depending on where it is, they can help the anti-Tory candidate. Whereas with PR, they can go, no, actually, I'm going to vote for my party of choice, because the Green Party do get enough votes to be able to potentially win an MP in each region. So they can then vote for that. So the vote share for the Green Party, because it always comes down come the election compared to now, because we're not in a campaign at the moment. When we get to election campaign, the vote, the polling for the Green Party comes down because people switch. They don't have to do that. So they will, all of a sudden, you'll find that they do get 8, 9, 10% of the vote.
Yeah.
And then if the MPs that they get are good and they start making a positive impression on Parliament, they will attract more supporters.
Yeah.
So what will happen is, just like in Germany, they will end up growing to the point where they are now part of government. You know, a coalition partner within government. Yeah. They're not going to win over half the vote, but they can be a kingmaker, which will give them a seat at the table.
It would indeed. Can I just jump in with Wobbly Filament there, who's put, Bing Bot says the most famous baked bean war occurred in July 1994 when QuickSave slashed the price of 425-gram tin of baked beans to 7p, a price last seen in 1971. Now, Phil, I remember this very clearly.
It was a penny. Went to a penny.
It went to a penny, yes, in Tesco on Rose Lane, because I was at a mate's house party in July of that year. And I was 15 at the time. And in the morning, we went to Tesco to get some breakfast. We found that the cans of baked beans were 1 pence each.
Yeah.
So being 15-year-old boys, we filled up an entire shopping trolley full of baked beans. We then pushed it to my mate's house. And then we stacked them up in front of his front door. And then we pressed the doorbell and ran away.
Stole a shopping trolley.
Yeah.
You're not doing your hometown any favors, are you? Well, I was a student at the time, so I was loading up on the baked beans. That's what I was having. But I remember that it was very useful to me because I was a university student.
Yeah. I mean, jokes aside, though,
I was definitely getting them.
I don't like it when they talk about let's bring in a sugar tax. I don't mind them saying let's calm down with the advertising for products that are bad for you, like lots of sugar in. But I would rather, instead of having a sugar tax, which makes sort of cheap junk food more expensive, which is sometimes the only protein that some people can afford, I'd rather they gave massive subsidies to healthy stuff. So a cabbage is a penny.
The thing I mean, they sort of do because there's no VAT on most things that are considered healthy. Ironically, there's no VAT on cakes, but there is on biscuits. That was always weird.
Really?
But yeah, because I learned this when I was a kid. I used to go to Macro, which is a wholesaler. So they had the prices not including VAT.
Yes.
And so some of the things would say VAT free. So you'd have things like fruit, veg, bread, VAT free. So cakes were obviously, when this was decided, considered a staple part of a diet, which I suppose when there was a lot more manual work going on, it would be.
That is weird, though, isn't it? Because when those taxes came in, it was, I mean, it started before VAT, it started on things like alcohol and tobacco. It was kind of to try and put people off a little bit. And so it was always on the stuff that wasn't good for you. But yeah, just talking about VAT, I mean, one of the big lies that the Brexiteers like to tell was about the VAT on tampons, which drove me up the wall because it was Britain that really pushed to make sure that all EU members had to have a minimum of 15% on VAT-able objects or products. And then the EU changed the rule before we did.
Yeah. Well, the thing is as well, so what happened, there's two things that's wrong about this. First of all, although we did cut VAT on tampons, that didn't get passed on to the consumer. The government did not. It's a bit like when they cut fuel duty last year. Yeah. It's like, we cut fuel duty by 5p, and then the pump, it went down by 1 pence because the petrol companies nixed the other 4 pence. The same thing happened. The Jaffa cake question. No, Jaffa cake's a cake. It's the clue's in the name, mate.
Because when it goes stale, it goes hard, and a biscuit, when it goes stale, it goes soft.
Soft, yeah.
Hey, Phil, go on. Sorry.
So because there's multiple lies about this VAT on tampons. The first is that the VAT cut did not get passed on to the consumer, so the consumer saw no benefit. Yeah. It just allowed the sellers to make more money. The second thing is, as you've just said, they all did it first. And the reason they did it first, do you remember before the EU, David Cameron is his last speech said, I'll get the EU to reform. All right, that'll take time, won't it? No, I'll sort it out. I'll go and have a word with them. They'll reform by next Tuesday. Don't you worry. So they go over there and he says, we need to reform. And everyone's fully on board. The EU reforms all the time. Yeah, the EU is like different to where it was 5 years ago, even. It reforms all the time. But anyway, he went over there and and this is what's annoyed me about the Brexiteers having a pop at Germany. Germany have been our closest allies in the EU forever. Yeah. We've often not seen eye to eye with France, but we often have seen eye to eye with Germany. Germany and Ireland were like our closest allies. Yeah. And but Germany, of course, were one of the other big three.
Well, also the Nordic countries as well were often on our side about stuff, Sweden and Denmark and Finland.
But so Merkel was all on board for these ideas of Cameron's. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, can you do it by next Tuesday? Well, no, of course not. No. But we're going to have a referendum. Well, whose fault's that? So
I'm laughing, but I'm crying inside.
Cameron came back with his tail in his legs, thinking, "Oh bloody hell, I couldn't get him to reform." So that made him look stupid, and also made the EU look more belligerent unnecessarily.
Yeah, true.
But the EU had already agreed that it should be. Because it's if anything, it's a sexual rights issue, isn't it?
Yes.
It's gender equality issue.
Yeah, it's gender equality.
So they did sort of agree, because the EU have different categories of VAT. There are some things that can be VAT zero, and all member states can raise their VAT above these levels, but you've got some things where zero is an acceptable form, some things where it's like 5% and then whatever. Yeah.
But
isn't
it crazy?
And they've already changed it.
The thousands and thousands of commodities that we traded within the EU when we were a member, and think about like how many moving parts there are in the car. And each of them, that the only thing they could find to say, oh, this is why we should leave the EU, was tampons. And it was like, okay, yeah, I agree that there shouldn't be VAT on that, but at the same time, is that all you got? Is that like the most pressing thing?
And as I say, something like that is easy to argue. Like it was argued. We did argue it, but it was easy to argue because of the EU is also a signatory of the European Convention of Human Rights, and you can argue that it was it was a tax on women, literally. So it was an easy one to argue that feminine products should not have VAT applied to them.
And it's not like they were making loads of money out of VAT anyway. Alec Barrett, thank you so much for the £10 super chat. Alec wants to say, prior to the Norman invasion, when we got invaded by people called Norman, England had a semi-federal system of 4 earldoms. Normans took out East Anglia immediately. Southern softies. Wessex soon after. Mercia took about a decade. Northumbria, where I am now, about 50 years.
Well, that's because ultimately it's because there's no one strong enough to control it all.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. But I mean, there has always been differences up here. Like when people talk about, England, I always say there isn't really any such thing as England. England is just the bit of Britain that's not Wales or Scotland. Because there isn't even a common language in England. There's no common identity. It's like, you tell me one thing that's iconically English that you wouldn't find in Scotland or Wales, and it doesn't exist in England either. It exists in a part of England. And the north of England is much more similar to Scotland, possibly because when Scotland invaded England, because when you watch the movie Braveheart, I'm not like, what they don't mention is that actually Scotland invaded England, and what Braveheart was the revenge for that. But Scotland invaded England and came all the way down. They would have done it as well. It was Bonnie Prince Charlie, the useless pudding, who got cold feet because they actually were there. They were about to capture the throne of England, and that was it. Scotland ruled England. But he thought there was an army laying in wait to ambush them, and there wasn't. So he ran away. But it took they'd already captured like the north of England, even as far down as Doncaster, where I'm from. So when you go to a lot of these places, like if you go to York almost looks like Scotland. You go into there and it's full of like all the women's clothes shops are full of like heather and tartan and stuff. And a lot of the culture is very similar to Scotland, like a lot of the plain speaking, which they don't like in the south of England. They get very upset, I've noticed. Even in the South
people
Midlands.
Talk to you more. I know this is a cliche, but people do talk to each other more in the north. I often told a story about a mate of mine who came up from London. This is back when I was in university, and he came to visit me in Liverpool. And I went into a shop, bought a can of Coke or something, and the guy behind the counter started having a chat with me about the football, and having a bit of a natter, and then I walked out. And my mate turns to me, he goes, Do you know that guy? And I went, no. He goes, well, why'd you talk to him then? Which is like such a London attitude. Like
the other thing as well is like even fish and chips. If you go to a fish and chip place in the south of England, a lot of them don't really have anything to go with it. Whereas up here, you can have mushy peas, you can have curry sauce, you can have gravy, stuff like that. You go to a lot of fish and chip shops in the south, they often don't. And it's like, well, what am I supposed to eat this with?
Michael Bling is saying, yes, add a sin tax to sugar. See the benefits in Mexico, the hate from Coca-Cola, and the savings to the NHS. Yeah, okay. I'll go along with that when it comes to sort of stuff like sugary drinks.
You can be specific about it. You don't have to say if it's got a certain amount of sugar content. You can exclude. So you can be quite specific about it if you want. You can have it apply to, say, savory snacks, or you'd have to be clever with the definition so people don't try and get out of it. But savory snacks, or you could actually say something like, if it's also got a protein content above a certain amount, because you mentioned the protein, you could have it as an exemption.
But I mean, look,
so
a program that they could do at the moment, you've got over 1 million people. Is it 1 million people using food banks now? What's the latest sort of?
I don't know at the moment. I'm not sure.
It is an obscene amount, a number of people. Okay, let's stop that. Let's have a system in which you go to the supermarket and everyone, once a week, you got a thing on your phone, little smartphone thing, and you get a selection of vegetables just for free, just for going to the supermarket. Set it up so it's, no one can take the piss. But
Graham, we've got a bit of shortage of vegetables.
I know. Well, this is once we're back in the EU.
We'll get all the manky stuff. Do you know what? The number of times I see now on Twitter people copying Tesco in, and they've just got a bag of potatoes from Tesco and they're showing like the whole bag is blighted. And I get that as well. I know about that.
Nothing's lasting, is it? I got some tangerines like less than a week ago, and they've already gone.
I don't even bother with those since Brexit. They were the first things just to go. They were coming like from Tenerife and places. Yeah. It's I have noticed, people can try and deny. I've done grocery shopping for decades. The stuff there's not only stuff I cannot get that I used to be able to get. The range has gone down. The actual range of goods has gone down. I still can't get Heinz mulligatawny soup. Every now and then they do a batch.
Yeah.
And then it's months before they do another one. It's like, I haven't been able to get it for months. But the fresh food has much shorter dates on it. The stuff we get stuff from Tesco, it's going to arrive this evening, right?
Yeah.
A load of it will go out of date tomorrow. That's just how it always is now.
Jesus.
One time a few months ago, everything on it had the next day or that day. Sometimes we get it in the evening, right? Yeah. Some of the stuff, the best before date is that day. Now, yeah, we know it lasts a bit. I am capable of telling when it's actually gone off, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I had 1 week where all of it was out the following day.
Bloody hell.
And it certainly was not going to last the week.
Yeah, yeah.
But even now, it's always the case that multiple things will have a best before date of that day or the day after.
Yeah.
Because when you go in, the dates are all shorter.
Yeah. Well, I would advise Lidl. I do all my shopping at Lidl, so I mean, they tend to have a little bit longer. But I've really noticed that in Tesco, in Sainsbury's, Asda, we don't really have Waitrose up here. I don't think they can get this far north.
The option you have if you've got the money for it, I sometimes get it because there's just stuff you can't get in Tesco now.
Yeah.
Is if you get an Ocado shop, so that's like the Marks and Spencers and stuff. That's different. In fact, I'll tell you what they do there. When you get your email on the day it's arriving, it will tell you if there's any short date stuff on it. And you know what? There never is. Yeah. Whereas on Tesco, they don't even do the short date stuff anymore. They used to tell you, because every now and then, of course, they'll try and pick that. It's like, are you all right with this? And you could then say yes or no. They don't do that anymore. They just give it to you. Yeah. So unless you're going to stand there and go through each date, go, no, send it back, but then you'll be left with nothing.
Yeah.
So Tesco don't now even tell you.
Big shout out to Wobbly Filament for a €10 super chat. You're thank you very, very much. And there was a message from a guy called, I've just lost it now because I scrolled down. I think it was Toy Techno. Even the good English are in denial about just how terrible their country has been and to a degree is. And I just want to address this point because I think you're right. And one of the big problems we have in this country is the education system. So I'm a graduate of history and politics. I did them for A-level as well. And I've also travelled extensively around the world. It wasn't until I went to Northern Ireland to meet with one of the people who helped write the Good Friday Agreement back in 2018 when I was doing Three Blokes in the Pub series that I was informed. Like, I just hadn't picked this up. I had studied this era in history, in political history as well, in the 1840s. But I didn't know that the Irish population, or the population of the entire island of Ireland, had still not recovered from the potato famine. That little fact had never, ever been thrown my way. And I felt at once like horrified and incredibly ignorant, considering how educated in that respect I'm supposed to be. So yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think, but I do believe that it's down to a lack of education and also a resistance on the part of some rather unsavory characters to admit that Britain did some really bad things in the past and continues to do bad things to this day. Let's face it.
Yes, it's because that it is. There's a deliberate reluctance to teach real Irish history in Britain.
Yes.
Because of our part in it. It's the same with the impact. I mean, when I only did GCSE history. So basically I did, up until that point, I just did kings and queens, all the medieval stuff, half of which was probably bollocks. And then at GCSE, which I had to do, I wouldn't have chosen to do it. I had to do it. We just did the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
That was it. So again, it's a deliberate attempt just to teach the sort of the useful contributions we made to the world, of which there are some, and completely ignore all the things that we should actually be ashamed of. Are we not ashamed because we didn't do them? But at least be there for balance.
At least know that they happened. I think that's the bigger problem for me. I mean, it's the least we can do. Let's, obviously we can talk about stuff like reparations, especially for nations in the West Indies and West Africa. But before then, the first step to just apologizing in any way, shape, or form is to acknowledge that it happened, just to know that it happened. It is literally the least we can do.
That is the thing. There's always calls for apologies for these things, and often they happen. And Britain formally apologized for the slave trade some time ago, for example. It doesn't hurt to do it again. But the problem is, an apology is one thing, but it's like, if you don't teach your own population what happened, you're not really apologizing, are you?
You're right.
It's just words.
You're right. And putting things in place to make sure that kind of thing never happens again. And when you see people writing articles for newspapers saying we should make Empire 2.0, we should go out and colonize, and you're just thinking, oh my God, seriously.
But it's because they don't know. Because like when people will say things like, when we've talked recently about that we've been moving towards sort of fascism under the Conservatives in the past few years. And people have this attitude that, okay, it went fairly badly wrong in Italy, Spain, and Germany, but we're different. It's like, no, we're not. Because we do have a fairly terrible history as well.
Well, just nationalism.
There isn't anything.
That was
there isn't anything. Yeah.
That was the thing that that guy, I forgot his name now. He said at the Tory party, the National Conservative Conference this week, he described, don't forget, like 74 million people died in World War I and II. And he said, we shouldn't be looking at nationalism as a bad thing just because Germany mucked up a couple of times. To be referring to the biggest genocide in human history as mucking up is just so. It's like they want to just diminish it. They want to go, oh no, it's not a big deal. It's a big Tory thing, isn't it? So it's not a big deal. You're being hysterical. If you complain about anything, you're just moaning, and you should, it's life. Get over it. And life's not fair. I've never heard someone who's really fighting just to keep their head above water to just, shrug and say life's not fair. It's something that only very, very rich people seem to say.
Yeah. Well, it's because it's a childish attitude. So it's an attitude that an adult will take when they've not grown up. So if you've been closeted your whole life and you've been shielded from consequences, then you will maintain what most of us would call a childish attitude. But it's not. It's a human attitude that you grow out of because it's not a productive attitude to have when you actually have to graft for a living.
Yeah. Thank you again to Danilo Pecha, who's just been amazing today with the super chats. Thank you. Another €20 super chat. And he says there is an understandable reason why Britain avoids large parts of its history. As a German, I know how painful it is to deal with the darker parts of your past.
What I would say is a difference, though, is in Germany, for some, you still might know someone who was involved in it because it's in living memory. Yeah. Both our behaviour in Ireland and the rest of the world is not. I mean, okay, I'm not saying we've been like bosom buddies with the whole world since, but in terms of the British Empire, the rise of empire, and our behaviour in Ireland, that is well out of living memory.
Yeah.
And so we could have a much more fruitful relationship, if nothing else. We're not treading on anyone's toes. Nobody alive today is responsible for it. Some people justify it, but no one alive today is responsible for it. So it shouldn't actually be painful to address it.
Yeah, and we should be able to have the knowledge in our toolkits to be able to basically refute anyone trying to apologize for it. I just want to jump into something that it's just got off the page. Daniel Dax said, saying World War One and Two was population control. This is something that my dad always used to reckon, and I'll say to David the same thing I said to my dad is like. It is the worst point. It's the worst way of doing population control. If you've got too many people, getting all the young men to go off and die in France is a really bad idea for toning down your population, because they're working age men, and one man can impregnate literally thousands of women. So if you're going to try and control your population, the easiest, cheapest, and most effective way of doing it is by educating women, and we're seeing that all over the world.
Yeah. The other thing is as well, I mean, that was never the motivation. The motivation was always greed. It was never a load of young men demanding that their government send them to war because there was too many of them to get a job.
Yes, that's true.
It was just a consequence that it also kept population down.
And if it was a world population control thing, then I think I know China was involved in World War II because it was invaded by the Japanese a few years earlier. But China and China and India.
India have gone ahead of China now, haven't they?
Being the main part of the war. Yeah, kind of.
That blew me away when I've just realised that India now has a larger population than China.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it was not that long ago that China had double the population of India.
I know. Well, they brought in the one-child policy, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly.
And educated women. We talk about the one-child policy a lot, but they did educate women as well. Whereas there's a lot of places in rural India where you really don't see women going to school as much as you should. And then in states like Kerala in South India, where you do have people in charge who actually seem to care about the people they're looking after, the people who voted for them, you see that they have the highest level of education in Kerala, and they also have one of the lowest birth rates as a result. And the longest longevity. People live longer. Can I just jump into some of the super chats here for a moment? We've got William Aarons dropping in a $5 super chat. Thank you very much. The United Kingdom's weakness as a state seems to be that it consists of different nations rather than regional federal states, as in Germany and France. Don't disagree with that. I think it's becoming more and more difficult to justify the first past the post London-centric system that we have in this country. And
that's why, as I say, what Labour, and it's what it only irritates me slightly because it's not working. But when people say, "Oh, Starmer's just going to tinker, he's not going to change anything," I just think, you're either lying or you haven't read, because what he's whether he achieves it is another matter. Having a plan and being able to deliver it are two different things. But the reforms he has in mind are like nothing we've seen in this country since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah. So just a big shout out to Mary Crow, who dropped a £10 super chat in and has a little gif with arms folded and sunglasses coming down. So thanks very much, Marie, for that. And there was a comment about Laura Trevelyan, who has given a £100,000 donation to a uni over in was it Grenada or Dominica? I can't remember which one it was. But basically it was to figure out how to solve problems from slavery on the island. And it's worth noting that we had the era of slavery, and then we had a little bit of a gap, and then we had the era of colonization. And there were two distinct eras of subjugation of black people. I mean, slavery killed millions, but then so did the scramble for Africa, especially in places like the Belgian Congo. Well, Britain doesn't really come out of it as a shining example of how to treat people. But it's something that we really should get into, and it's in our interests to do so. And economically, it makes more sense to sort this stuff out and raise the level of education and the economies of the places that used to be part of the British Empire, or even places that weren't, that are now part of the British Commonwealth, because then they will have the money to buy stuff off us. And this is my big argument against Brexit, was like, who are we going to trade with? The rich people all live in our neighborhood. We're literally trekking barefoot to the other side of the world to try and sell things that people on the other side of the world can't afford to buy, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. The G7 meeting is going on at the moment in Japan, and it's not actually just a meeting of the G7. Hosts invite other people as well. The EU always gets invited because it's not a member of the G7, but it's like the three largest markets in the world are China, the United States, and the EU.
Yeah.
So it always gets invited, but the host always invites a few others as well, and it's a mark of just how important the EU is. Japan has invited quite a few other countries, like Australia and representatives from Africa, and a few others as well, like South Korea, and I think who's this South American one? Maybe Brazil. I mean, Brazil would be the obvious one.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, of course, so America's huge on its own in the G7. You've got France, Italy, and Germany, which are part of the EU. So they're already part of this huge group. And, you know, the likes of Japan and Canada are large nations, but they're, you know, Canada will probably align much more closely with the United States, which got that. But Japan hasn't really got anyone.
No.
So, you know, you take it as a sign that it is. And Japan's got a larger economy than we have, really. Although it's got a much larger population, so I'm not sure how it works out in the wash. But nonetheless, they don't feel that they can go it alone. So they are actively seeking allies around the world, and by inviting multiple countries to this G7 meeting, you know, that is part of their efforts to form alliances, because they know that their culture doesn't naturally fit in with the West, with Europe and America. So they need their own alliances. India and China have sort of got their own thing going on. Japan's obviously not ever going to, in the foreseeable future, align itself with China. They don't like each other very much. So
they have a border dispute, don't they?
Well,
India's got a border dispute with all of its neighbours, I think, apart from maybe Nepal.
But India aligns much more with China. It's much happier to align with China, and even Russia to a certain extent, although they haven't condemned Russia for their action in Ukraine, but they're not. I don't think they're terribly happy with it either, just like China.
There was a resolution that went through the UN a couple of weeks ago where in the preamble to the resolution, it said that it was an illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the resolution was passed. So those countries like India and China, it was a bit of a signal that they're not happy about the situation, but obviously diplomacy has to take its
But the point is that Japan, which should have as much a chance as us of going it alone, they're not trying to go things alone.
No.
So,
no.
You know, it's...
no man is an island. John Donne said it in the 17th century. He was right. It is a case of who if we can improve conditions for poor people living in this country, or economically disadvantaged people living in this country, it improves our economy. If we can improve the situations or help improve the situations with countries around the world, it means they can buy more stuff off us. In the long run, it's actually a win-win situation. It's the moral thing to do. And economically, it's a good idea.
The last Labour government literally cancelled crap loads of debt from poorer countries. Just cancelled it.
Yeah. Yeah, which
and
is the
we
right
didn't
thing
exactly
to do.
suffer economically during that last Labour government.
No, we didn't. And that was what you're supposed to do with a bad unpayable debt. And those debts annoyed the hell out of me, because they were usually run up by warlords who had taken over the country by force, murdered millions of the people in the given country, or at least hundreds of thousands. And then they finally get, after years of conflict, a democratically elected government in charge, and they're saddled with billions of dollars worth of debt from the person before. It's like someone owning a house, and then they get done for murder, so they're turfed out, and then you buy the house, you turn up the first day, and you get arrested for murder, and you're like, it had nothing to do with me. Why would you punish me for the crime of my predecessor? Especially when a lot of these strongmen dictators of the 60s and 70s were installed by the CIA. I'm not going into a big conspiracy hole here, but the CIA did like to interfere, especially in South America, Central America.
But anyway, it's just trying to see here. China's actually doing a form of colonialism, a kind of economic, financial colonialism. So does everyone. I mean, ultimately, any major country becomes a major country or a major economy ultimately by taking more of its share of resources.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is. We're a wealthy country, not that you'd know it in terms of what the population get out of it, but we're a wealthy country ultimately because we take more than our fair share.
Yes, and we always have done.
And every government really, we should be appointing governments that want to work in the national interest, and that national interest is always, can we take another piece of cake?
Yeah.
VAT-free, of course.
Tim, that said, I know it's not quite the same, but I've moved into a house and been forced to use the same utility providers because the last tenant signed a contract. Yes, Tim, that's exactly what it's. Well, God, that's pretty much what it's like. It's like, well, I didn't sign up to this. I didn't agree to these terms. But yeah, if you have a bad debt, if it's an individual or a company, I mean, think about all the debts that are written off when a company collapses and the company just says, we've gone bankrupt, and no one's liable for that because they're all limited companies. So yeah, that's it's a bit of a it was a source of frustration, and I was part of the protest up in Scotland. Remember when there was a ring of people dressed in white around the castle up in Edinburgh? I was part of that back in 2005, I think it was. The Drop the Debt campaign, the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was tremendously effective, and it's helped a bunch of countries, but still, where we are now, we still have a world where there's the bottom billion, and there's a lot of countries that we call developing nations, but they're simply not developing. And I want to go into one of the other comments that's come in about China's neo-colonialism that's been called in Africa. The interesting thing about this is, if you go to Africa these days, if you travel around Africa, you'll see a lot of Chinese infrastructure that's been put in. And you might see some actual Chinese people there, especially in places like Congo and Angola and stuff like that. But the amount of money that the Chinese government is investing is the most of one country in the world, but it's not the most that is being poured into Africa to get the resources out. Actually, the number one slot goes to the EU. So it's actually European, well, not necessarily the EU as an entity, but countries that are in the EU. So former colonial powers like Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, putting that money in, and meddling. Would you like some money? Would you like some money to build a train line, Phil? Would you? Well, you're gonna have to talk.
The thing is, though, you mentioned France and Britain do have a fundamentally different relation to their former colonies, though. France actively tries to foster much better relations, whereas we seem to sulk when they wanted independence.
Yeah.
And treat them like poorer cousins or something. Whereas France is much more popular in former French colonies than Britain is in former British colonies.
Yeah, but at the same time,
although we gave them cricket, we didn't really foster those positive relations.
I met a few people in West Africa and Central Africa who were not at a sort of political level. They were not happy with what they saw as French meddling in their democracies. And I could see that to some extent. But then you have a situation like we had in Mali a few years ago when you had sort of ISIS of the Sahara running around destroying buildings and terrorizing the place. And the French army went in. The French army said, okay, we'll sort this out. But then again, that's not that different to what the British army did in Sierra Leone at the turn of the millennium when the war had been raging there for a few years at that point. And they only went over there to get the British out, and they realized that this war was being fought by children with AK-47s, and it was kind of like a good news story at the time, because this horrible war, which has spilled over from Liberia next door, was ended by British intervention. And you could tie that in with what happened in Kosovo, where we had the K4 troops going in with NATO, which stopped Serbians massacring ethnic Albanians there. But at the same time, like, that gave Tony Blair this like Messiah, great white savior complex, which led him to go, hey, let's go and invade Iraq. And everything that's been bad in the last 20 years has the roots in that Iraq conflict, from the credit crunch to the Brexit vote to Trump to Boris Johnson, all of it. Bad move.
It was an absolutely shocking error. I mean, what happened ultimately is George Bush had determined he wanted to do this thing to finish off Daddy's work.
Yeah.
And Blair thought, this is going to go tits up with you in charge, monkey boy. So he thought he could form an international alliance because, you know, he was a much more pro-European leader, much more clearly pro-European. And he thought, you know, oh, I can form an international alliance because I'm the dog's bollocks.
Yeah.
And he didn't. But the only reason, but what he'd had to do, apparently, he'd had to promise George Bush that Britain would stand by him, come what may, but just give me time to form an international alliance to give you credibility.
Yeah.
He failed to do so because, of course, it was a stupid idea. And yeah, and I think you're right. It was born of the ego that grew from two very, particularly Kosovo, a very successful campaign, military campaign, for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
And he'd messed it up. And once he'd given his word, that was it.
Yeah.
So then you ended up with him basically telling stupid lies to Parliament in order to get it through because he'd given his word foolishly. Whereas what he should have said to Bush was, this isn't a good idea. We should at least try and get international support for this. I will help you, but this is an absolutely mad plan. And if I will help you get this international support, but I will be with the international support. If you don't get it, we don't get it. You're on your own, Sal.
Yeah, and that's why someone's put in the chat there that it was an illegal act. It was a crime, and that's hard to argue with. For me, I think, well, the idea of trying to bring stability through outside force, it had worked in a couple of regions around the world up to that point, but this was a civil case going on. The northern part of the country that had been gassed, the Kurdish region that had been gassed by Saddam Hussein in the early 90s, they were an autonomous region. They had their own flag, their own parliament. They did their own thing. They were kind of separate. They check your passport when you come out of Kurdistan into the rest of Iraq. So it was like a problem that wasn't a particularly, I mean, you could argue it was a festering boil, but the idea to destroy an entire country's civil service and government and army, you know, the Ba'athist regime, to get rid of one person, it wasn't just the case of trying to crack a nut with a sledgehammer. It was trying to assassinate someone with a nuclear weapon.
The reason why Bush wanted to do it, of course, is because Iraq was subject to sanctions, and his family being an oil family, that was not good for business.
Yeah.
And so he wanted those sanctions lifted. He knew that they couldn't lift the sanctions while Hussein was behaving as he was. So they thought, right, well, we need to get rid of him. So that's what it was ultimately about. It was about his family's wealth.
Yeah.
As many of these things are, it's about someone's wealth and power.
I find it interesting if it had gone well and things had turned out better for people in Iraq and we hadn't had the horror show that we went through, well, they went through in Iraq with ISIS and everything. If that all hadn't happened and they just got rid of Saddam Hussein, if we would still be sitting here 20 years later going, yeah, that was a massive crime against humanity.
Well, in terms of the crime thing, so we'll sort out a few things here. So first of all, people will say things like, these people, Tony Blair and so on, are war criminals. It's like, well, no, they're not, because they didn't commit a war crime. It was an illegal war. The way we know it was a legal war, by the way, is not because you think it was or you disagree with it or other countries didn't go along with it. The reason I know it was an illegal war, because I'm not a lawyer and it never went to court, was because the government's top legal advisor resigned over the issue. That is always a sign that the government's breaking the law, right?
Yeah.
So that's the only reason. But it wasn't a war crime. There are war crimes. It's like human rights legislation. There's specific things there. We didn't breach any of those. America may have done on the torture front. We didn't.
Yeah.
So Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, well, you can't. I mean, Alistair Campbell's a spin doctor anyway, not to do with it. But you know, Tony Blair, the rest of his cabinet, they weren't war criminals. They committed an illegal act. What the consequence would have been, I don't know, because it's like the Tories have committed any number of illegal acts as well. The Tory government have been found to have committed, obviously much less serious, but still illegal acts. There's no criminal action behind it because it's not a criminal act.
Yeah.
In the same way. So that's the situation with it. But it was still from our point of view, a stunningly stupid move to get involved with it.
Oliver's saying if you think the UK didn't and doesn't commit war crimes, it's hopelessly fanciful. I think that you're talking about the definition of what a war crime is.
Yeah, exactly. But, so if Tony Blair had actually authorized, for example, British soldiers to carry out acts of torture, that would be a war crime. But you would have to prove that he did that, not that it happened, not that say, for example, some prisoners were handed over to American forces at a lower level where they shouldn't have been because maybe the American forces were probably going to torture them. You would actually have to be able to prove that the UK government had specifically authorized us to take part in torture. And there is no evidence of that. And, as I say, you do have to be a little bit careful when you're talking about things like this. You can say that something's wrong. You can say it's morally wrong. You can even say it's legally wrong. But you have to be careful about what laws you think they're breaking.
It drives you up the wall when people who, they'll say, oh, well, if you think Boris Johnson's bad, what about Tony Blair? And I'm like, I'm not going to sit here and defend what Tony Blair did, especially in context of Iraq. He absolutely did the wrong thing. He started an illegal war, which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And
I would say no to that one because America would have done it anyway.
Yeah, but we didn't have to be involved.
He got us involved in it.
We didn't have to be involved.
Yeah.
And I've got friends who served over there, and it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. Not least because the Americans kept on killing British.
Well, Americans are useless. That's why.
Friendly fire.
The safest place to be, if the Americans are involved in a battle, is on another continent.
Yeah.
They have in the past bombed Canadian. There was a time when they bombed a Canadian medical convoy. I can only imagine because they saw a red cross on top of it and thought it was a target. But, they have the most sophisticated hardware in the world, but the poorest trained troops.
But I often find this with people who sort of hero worship a particular celebrity or politician. And when you say, I think that politician is evil or stupid or not very good, their response to you is, well, what about politician X, who, like, if they did something like that was, if they committed a murder or they sexually assaulted someone, I wouldn't be sitting here going, oh, I'm going to defend them anyway because I like their politics. No, I'd just drop them like a hot stone. I think John Bercow is the best example of this. I loved John Bercow when he was Speaker of the House. I thought he was brilliant. I thought he was absolutely brilliant during the whole Brexit thing. And then it came out that he'd been bullying his staff. And I know personally people who have worked with John Bercow. And when that came out, they were like, that's probably true, actually. He was a bit like that. So I wasn't sitting there on Twitter going, this isn't true. It's a conspiracy. What about XYZ? And I think that's just a weird way of responding to this person has done a bad thing. And it's like, yeah, but what about that other person who did that? I'm like, that's bad too. Just because they're on the same political side as me doesn't mean that I don't think it's bad.
No. Well, in fact, you do have to call it out more because otherwise you end up falling into sort of tribal politics where you automatically defend or condemn someone because of where they are. It's almost like you can imagine. So let's say most people in this chat probably are not really happy with the Conservatives. So let's say you see a news article that says Tory MP accused of something or other. You will automatically think that they're guilty and someone's probably going to get them off. Then see the same headline, such and such politician, but they're in a party you approve of. And all of a sudden you start to think, hang on a minute, are we sure about this? And what evidence is there? You start to be naturally more critical when it's sort of someone on your side. And my argument is often you need to actually be critical regardless of it. In fact, you need to be more critical if it's someone on your own side of defending them, or more critical of attacking someone on the other side. Apply the same sort of measures. How sure are you of it?
Yeah.
Because there can be innocent Conservatives who get accused of things, and there can be people who are on your own side who are guilty of things, and you have to accept that.
Yeah. Andreas Wolf making a very good point about denazification in 1945, in which they started with the big bosses and let many of the small fishers go because the entire civil service was Nazi at that time, but you still needed the civil service to run a country. Debathification in Iraq, they got rid of all the small fish, and so there was no bureaucracy, there was no civil service, and they disbanded the army. It's just because of one person, but that was all part of the plan, wasn't it? If you read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, she doesn't sort of lay out a very, very persuasive case that was all done on purpose to basically strip the country of its assets, which, can't necessarily disagree with.
Ultimately is what it was all about. It was George Bush. If we didn't have economic sanctions on Iraq, don't matter how Saddam Hussein was behaving, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
And as I say, it would have all happened anyway. Yeah. But we shouldn't have been involved. We shouldn't have had our fingerprints on it.
Nope, absolutely.
But again, it is, and I don't want to downplay it by saying it's just one thing, but it is one thing. And when people sort of ignore everything else that happened with the Labour government, nationally as well as internationally, it was still, and also, who believes that if the Conservatives were in power, they'd have done anything differently?
Well, that's a good point. And the one thing that I keep saying about an upcoming Labour government is at least we can hold them to some degree more accountable than we can with the Tories, because we can't hold the Tories to any kind of decorum, never mind the law. It's evident that the tabloids are still going to hate Labour when they're in power. The Novara Media and Double Down News are still going to be making videos about how terrible Keir Starmer is, and Owen Jones is still going to be out there telling people to vote for the Lib Dems or something, whatever he's doing these days. Colin says Owen Jones is anti-Keir before all other politics. That's the problem. That was before I said the words Owen Jones. That just popped up. So I can see that. But we're gonna have to wrap it up there, Phil, because we're 23 minutes over time. It's just nice to have a chat. I thought we were going to talk about the ridiculous things that the Tories have done this week.
It went a bit off track, didn't it?
Got a bit off track, as things do on these live shows. But then we're having a conversation here, not just with each other, but obviously with you in the chat as well. So thank you so much for all of the wonderful messages coming in. Phil, have you got anything to add before we sign off?
No, I might as well just add this up. One, there's comments about Owen Jones here. Owen Jones made a good point about Labour biggest in hung parliament. It's the only way we might get PR voting and stuff, the Tories. Yes, I've said as much myself, but at the end of the day, it's also not certain. What could also happen is that the parliamentary maths isn't there for any sort of stable Labour government at all, even with PR. And they get nothing done, and the Tories come straight back in before it can be even be implemented. So it is one of these situations. Basically, the best way to introduce PR is to, I think it has to be in Labour's interests. I think it is in Labour's interest, because once the reforms are implemented, the only way to defend them is to introduce PR, as I see it. Now, as long as the Labour leadership see that as well, they will introduce PR in a couple of parliaments.
Yeah.
But will they see that? That's the trick, really. Yeah. But thinking that a hung parliament with Labour being the biggest party, because as soon as you even want a hung parliament with Labour as the biggest party, that means, because where we are now, the polling, where we are now, Labour have a lead of like 150 to 200 majority. That's huge, stupid. It's not going to be that. To get down to hung parliament levels, Labour would have to do so badly over the next years. Something like Keir Starmer would probably have to be caught like interfering with monkeys or something. So what has to happen is so bad that you'd actually risk the Conservatives being winning it. So that's the problem when you wish for a hung parliament from the position we're in now. If you wish for a hung parliament with the position Labour were in 2019, that's different, because that's progress. Yeah. Now you're actually wanting Labour to really fall from grace in the public's mindset, which inevitably means the beneficiary of that are the Conservatives. So being realistic, and I like to be pragmatic, the situation is Labour are going to win a majority because the Tories are bog useless at the moment. They've gone crazy. They've absolutely gone crazy.
Yeah,
and Labour are not going to go crazy. They're going to keep. And we're also, one of the things that people keep saying about Labour is, oh, I don't know what their policies are. It's much harder to say that now when they're out there. But I will confess, Labour are not making it easy. Like, I wish I could just link you a part of their website that had them all listed, and I can't. They're all over the place.
Yeah.
But over the next year, because Labour are now in the final steps of agreeing their manifesto promises, over the next year, they're going to start explaining them to the public. So actually, Labour are going to get, I'm not going to say they're going to be on for a large majority, but they're going to get stronger. So we are going to get a majority Labour government. So we need to think, how do we get PR with that? And ultimately, we have to persuade Labour that it is in, and I say Labour, the Labour leadership, because the Labour membership is already in favour of it, and so are many of the affiliated unions, and many of their MPs, but not all. Yeah. So we need to
There's many people in the shadow cabinet who are all for PR. Yeah. Johnny Reynolds, who's the business secretary.
We need to persuade them that it is in Labour's interest. It's the only way to defend their reforms. And it is the only way. Because think about the reforms that the last Labour government brought in. What is left? It's not a lot.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Phil, for joining us this afternoon. A little roundup of what's been going on, I guess. I was going to say over the last week, but I think we've covered the last 30 years, so that's pretty good.
We've covered the last 300 years, haven't we?
Thank you for everyone who's commented. Thank you for all the incredible super chats. We really appreciate them. And thank you to all of the YouTube members and the patrons who are supporting this channel and helping it grow. I'll be back tonight at 9 o'clock live for a Labour Social, or the Labour Social, with Super Tansky and Aid Thompson and Ollie, who does Bowler Hat Man. So look out for that, and I hope to see you there in the chat. And until then, I'll say thanks for watching. Hello, good evening, welcome, and goodbye.